not floating him off his body, like, you know.
Yeah, maybe you're not.
We have legs too. Welcome back to Sika Strength, and today we're looking at John Haack, so one of the greatest currently lifting powerlifters, and if he keeps going the way he is, potentially one of the greatest, if not the greatest of all time powerlifters. So he's done some outrageous lifts, and we wanted to talk through 3 things that you can get from John Haack's training that can benefit you, or that we think is important from his training that will help you in your own trainings, help you identify some aspects.
I think the first thing for us is definitely John's squat. So when we see powerlifters of this kind of caliber, we'll tend to see squats that are very inclined over. They're very low bar, like purely low bar squats. Whereas John has a very, very nice upright torso. He's very knees forward. His toes are very pointed forward. He's no valgus knee rotation as he stands back up. And overall, it's a very applicable squat for most athletes to be able to go and do. Now, John is very well built for squatting, but by no means is he like the super short femored, really long back individual. It's not like you're watching Liu Xiaojun or some of the Olympic weightlifters where their squat's going to be super upright anyway. Like, this is probably something that John has to work on to get into these positions. It's not like he has the super short legs, you know. So I think definitely if you're a powerlifter or somebody who's just getting into lifting weights, or you're somebody who's quite experienced with lifting and you want to try and push your squat more than you've been pushing it previously, going more towards this model of toes pointed more straight forward, knees pushing further ahead, and being much more quad dominant in your squat will be very beneficial for you.
So this is a style of squat that we're always kind of pushing for people, even for our powerlifters. Now, the beauty of this kind of style of squat is that it's something you can do with a low bar position, but you still emphasize the same drivers, which is your quads. So these are the main movers, so it's a heavily knee forward movement. Now, you can still do this movement with that low bar position, but we don't really like that traditional kind of sit back, open up your knees style squatting for most powerlifters. One, because it just destroys your hips over a career of powerlifting. You see a lot of people with hip injuries. 2, this is mostly because it's a remnant of equipped powerlifting or geared powerlifting, although no one really calls it geared powerlifting anymore because, you know, gear obviously stands for performance-enhancing drugs and not wearing 2 or 3 ply suits. So you can alter these squat mechanics when you're wearing this extra layer or extra skin or wearing this forklift around your hips that allows you to sit back and kind of overcome the mechanical deficiencies of opening up your knees and sitting back and keeping your shin angle as vertical as possible. What we want for most raw powerlifters, so people wearing sleeves or knee wraps and belts, is this kind of quad dominant squat that we're looking for. We see the vast majority of people benefiting mostly from this. They're more consistent with it, they're more powerful with it, they feel better with it, they're certainly in better positions optimally from what it looks like when they're squatting. So we get a variety of different benefits from this, and people actually benefit a lot from it. Most people, especially natty lifters, are not able for that low bar sitting back vertical shin style squat because it requires a huge amount of lower back and mid back strength, and eventually this will be not feasible as the weights get heavier because that mid and lower back are just not able to withstand those loads efficiently in terms of, you know, maybe injury risk, but also more importantly is the amount of weight they can lift due to the absence of performance enhancing drugs. You know, we do see if you take a shit loads of drugs, they will overcome those kind of mechanical deficiencies, and you can kind of alter your squat. Even in that scenario, like John Haack, who's openly talked about PED, so we can say that very, very definitively, this position for the vast majority of lifters is a better way of squatting, you know, and it's great to see one of the greatest powerlifters using this style of squat for his main lift, you know. And we push a lot of our powerlifters. If you watch the Hayden series or you run any of our powerlifting programs, we push the high bar squat a lot, and we talk about belt squats and high bar squats being very, very important and the main accessory movements for the competition squat.
There are certain elements of John's squat definitely that wouldn't be applicable for a lot of lifters, particularly lifters who aren't lifting these kind of similar amounts of weights. So one thing in particular is you'll see John's elbows coming forward quite a lot as he sits into the bottom position, and they kind of stay underneath the bar then as he stands back up. For most people, in order to generate the upper back tightness and maintain that upper back position, we'd want the elbows back slightly more and you just more engaged in the upper back. Obviously, this isn't an issue for John as he has an unbelievably strong mid and upper back and he's well able to maintain those positions. You'll just be able to see this by looking at him. The size of his upper back and his upper back development certainly isn't going to be an issue for that.
The second thing we want to talk about for John Haack is John Haack's deadlift technique. So he uses a conventional style deadlift. I don't think we've ever seen him do sumo deadlifting. but obviously because he's not a cheater. But so he does conventional deadlift with some phenomenal form, and there's a couple of different things that we really like about that. One is his toes are straight forward and his feet are quite close. So they're it's basically around hip width for John, and this allows him to use his legs very, very efficiently. And the main thing we're always pushing with our deadlift form, and we'll definitely do a video like we did for the squat video recently, is we really want to emphasize that knees forward position. So you want to keep your knees forward for as much as possible. So they're a much better driver of the ground. The deadlift, a conventional deadlift, is as much a squat from the ground as a pull. So it's oftentimes you hear people talking about pushing and pulling at the same time for the conventional deadlift, and that is something we really want to emphasize. And so if you bring your feet under your hip width, you get a lot of knees forward movement. You get a quad drive and a shitload then of leg drive from the floor. And then you want to keep these knees forward for as long as possible and keep them engaged for as long as possible. Like, you don't want to shift to the kind of primarily hamstring and lower back until as late as possible when you're finishing the movement. You want to keep your knee extensors pushing as hard as you can throughout the whole lift. And I think John does a great example of this in his technique.
The other thing with John's deadlift, and it's certainly a lot of something a lot of amateur powerlifters could learn a lot from, is there's no extravagance in the setup of the deadlift. He remains quite dynamic. He stands over the barbell, he gets tight, he drops down and he pulls it off the floor. Now, it's not like he's dropping down without any prep work done, without any amount of tension being generated prior to that, but he's not standing over the bar for the kind of 15-second pre-performance routine of slapping each quad and then dropping one leg and then dropping the other leg and grabbing one hand and grabbing the other hand. It's important he's still getting almost that kind of dynamic start where he's dropping down, developing tension, and then going quite quickly. I definitely think we see a lot of people losing positions either from not developing tension at the start or else from trying to overdevelop tension and staying in that setup position for too long. And by the time they've held that isometric hold for 15 or 20 seconds, once they get past kind of the end of their first pull, they start to lose a lot of tension in the mid-back.
So that's another important aspect of John's technique that we think is very, very important to look at for your own training. So John does what we'd call a top-down kind of dynamic start in weightlifting. So he doesn't drop his hips below the line of where he starts and raises them up into it. So what he does is go straight from top down and he drops straight into it. So we'd call it a grip and rip kind of start position. So weightlifters that would have started like this would be people like David Riggert or similar kind of Ilya Ilyin. So where the hips come down and they come no lower than where he starts the barbell or where he starts in his start position. And what this does is it really loads the muscles appropriately. So pre-stretched muscles can apply more force, and that's why dynamic start works very, very well. But a lot of times when we see people is they'll drop their hips too low, they'll kind of hold on to the barbell, rock back, and they'll sit their hips really low down and then rock into their start position. And it feels comfortable and it feels kind of like you're moving around nicely, but in general it's a very poor position because you don't start in the most optimal position because it's not the most consistent position, and in general you're not in the tightest and not in the best position to start from, because the people will have a tendency then to start much too low. So I know we talked about we want our knees forward and our quads engaged a lot, but there's obviously a point of diminishing returns from that where it becomes suboptimal, where you have a large amount of back swing forward to get into a good position, whereas you just want to be at that nice shallow knee depth position but then keep those quads engaged.
The last thing, and this is definitely my favourite thing about John Haack, and it's something I try and pass on to other people, is that his programming and his general thoughts around training are very, very simple. When he sets out a training cycle, he's talked about this, its main focus, like 70 to 80% of total volume in each training session, is on the main lifts, the squat, the bench and the deadlift. He doesn't really focus a huge amount on isolation work. I know he's spoken on the Mark Bell podcast about doing one set of curls a year and he's still absolutely jacked arms. It's obviously due to a host of other factors, but a simple, refined programming technique. He says he's now run so many training cycles where he understands what he can hope to add in each training cycle. He'll roughly know what his singles are going to look like over the course of the next few months, but he won't really dive in and start kind of getting lost in the minutiae of the program. He just sets out a plan, he follows it, and doesn't worry too much about the minor details.
So one of the things that's interesting about John is he said on the Mark Bell podcast that he routinely misses a lift in his training. I think this is a very interesting indicator of his kind of thought process around training, is that a lot of the times what we'll see and this is mostly with our kind of amateur powerlifters. I'd say almost exclusively with our amateur powerlifters, is that they're kind of afraid to push themselves, which is in some ways very commendable. You want to be smart with your training, you want to be diligent with your training, you don't need to be failing lifts, and we're not talking about maxing out every day, but it is interesting to see how far you push themselves. Sometimes we see people when they get some of our programs, for example, and we'll get an email and they'll say, damn, this looks really heavy, I don't know if I'll be able for this in a couple of weeks, and then invariably they'll end up smashing those weights, and I think it's important to push yourself in training. So while you still train smart and you train quite simply, I suppose, you still push yourself very, very hard. And I think that's definitely something to always be aware of in your training, especially for strength training, is how aggressively am I pushing myself. You still push yourself in a smart direction. Like I said, it's not that maxing out every day, or it's not going for a max single every week and doing your drop off sets or whatever. It's still push yourself in a difficult direction, but it's as challenging as possible. But I think it's an interesting indicator. They talked about failing lifts at least every cycle, at least one lift every cycle, that he's pushing himself to those limits. You need to see where you're at, and you've got to push yourself to new limits. You've got to attempt new weights, otherwise you won't be able to squat those heavier weights. You've got to push your set to 3 and your set to 5 and your set to 2s and your 1s, otherwise you'll never be able to hit a PB. It won't happen until you push those upper end weights for sets and reps. If there's another powerlifter or weightlifter or other athlete you'd like us to look at, feel free to leave it in the comments and we will definitely have a look.